Special thanks to WaterStone for sponsoring Socrates in the Studio Season 3. The culture, according to your view, is behaving in a way as though we are, as a culture, schizophrenic, as though our right brain is not functioning as it ought. That's an amazing thesis. It's an amazing observation.
Yes, but in a way it sort of follows. I didn't think that suddenly we'd all got schizophrenia, nor did Louis Sass. So there had to be an explanation. And the explanation was that in our culture we are encouraged to think of things in a very left hemisphere dominant way. And so we're trained in that from an early age. All our education is like that, public discourse.
But it wasn't always, is the point.
It wasn't always like this.
So this is a more recent development.
Well, yes, it's gathered pace since the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, to some extent the American Revolution, was about a hubristic belief that we could do away with all these things that were just superstitions, like that there is a spiritual realm, that morality is actually about a cast of mind as much as about rule following, that we can explain everything. We can explain all our experience, our awe before nature, before music, before in sort of rationalistic terms. And although I often say, if I'd been alive at the time, I'd have thought this is great.
It's exciting. Because you don't know how it can go wrong yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we've had ample evidence of how it goes wrong over the subsequent 250 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, the Enlightenment, what I would call an overfocus on reason and a certain way of thinking.
Exactly.
It's somewhat mechanistic. You get this a little bit from Newton, that everything is a machine, and there's a usefulness to thinking that way. But if you take it too far, it breaks down. And what you're saying is that in subsequent centuries, it has broken down. We've relied so much on that way of thinking that we've lost a lot.
It has, and you made a very good point there, which is that it's not that it has no value. It's that it needs to be balanced, and you can take it too far. But this is something that the left hemisphere does not understand. And so we get all around us, that was good. We have had a little bit of that, but there's a whole other side to this story that's being neglected. And the left hemisphere just goes, no, this is the path we're going on.
Well, to take the title of your book, so you're saying that the emissary has become the master, or has usurped the role of the master.
Usurped the role of the master, but without any of the wisdom that goes with being the master. And I'm not suggesting that, as it were, everybody in a culture has to think this way, but predominant ways of thinking can rule out those important ones that are superficially incompatible. Now, it's worth my just glossing that for a moment. So the right hemisphere is aware that a thing and its opposite may actually both have validity. And that is extremely important. But the way we think now, which is very left hemisphere dominant, the left hemisphere goes, how can a thing and its opposite be compatible? No, absolutely not. It's either this or it's that. And the right hemisphere is much more both and, but it realizes the value of either or as well. So what we need is not either or both and, but we need both either or and both and. And the right hemisphere is able to do that. It sees what the left hemisphere is saying. It says, yes, it's a useful contribution. Now let me take that back into the big picture. But nowadays we never look at the big picture, where this is going historically, where it has come from historically, what the arguments against it are. And if you point out to managers in a system, and I've had experience of this in the two areas I know something about, hospitals and universities, if you point out that a certain fashionable idea they've had, this is how we're going to do it, and the clinicians or the teachers, the lecturers say, well, that's not really how we do it, but no, this is how we have to do it. So it's done. After a while, one can see this is actually counterproductive, and then you point out to them, what we're doing here is counterproductive, which we thought it was. How about changing course? But you can guarantee they will never be big enough or broad-minded enough to say, That's a good point. Let's think differently. They will double down on what has already not worked, saying, but we just haven't done enough of it yet.
Now, part of what you're saying, it seems to me, has to do with the concept of wisdom. In other words, the right brain, when we're talking about wisdom, it seems like a right brain thing. Because when you think of computing or that has nothing to do with wisdom.
No.
It's important, but it doesn't get to the level of wisdom. And if you're not talking about wisdom, humanity becomes reduced. We really become either machines or dumb beasts, I guess.
Yes.
But it's fascinating to me that you're talking about this in culture, and that you talk. I know I can see how things go wrong from the Enlightenment and this kind of thinking and the utopist lunacy of the French Revolution or the Soviet Revolution.
Yes, leads on to all the great massacres of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I would leave the American Revolution out. We don't have time to argue about that. But this tendency, are you saying that this has accelerated in recent decades?
It seems to have caught hold in a very seriously detrimental way rather quickly. So it seems the pace is accelerating. I think there's a positive feedback loop operating. So just to gloss that, a negative feedback loop is like a thermostat. When the temperature goes down, it turns the heating on. When it gets too hot, it turns the heating off. So it corrects. A positive feedback loop is one in which whatever is happening gets accelerated, even though it's out of control. So it just goes more and more and more, rather like the managers I was speaking about. So this is how our culture is now functioning. There is not enough tolerance for people to say, I want to put a different point of view altogether on this thing. But nowadays, remember, the left hemisphere is not reasonable as it used to be thought to be. It is not only not very clever, literally it's not very intelligent, but it also, as I say, gets in a huff if it's contradicted, because it knows it's right. It always knows it's right. And one reason you can tell the left hemisphere is wrong, because it always knows it's right. So in that sort of frame of mind, we have a lot of enormously left hemispheric people at the tops of bureaucracies. This is what we do. People on social media can't hear any other point of view than the one they hold. They're not like, isn't it interesting that other intelligent people actually see things a little differently from me? Perhaps I should listen to them and learn a bit about it. And we could have a conversation. I could say, well, I see this. What do you think about that? But that's not how we work now.
I'm saving all my big, exciting questions for part two, which will come in a few minutes. But while we're still in part one of this conversation, just to make sure that I'm understanding or tracking correctly, when we speak of a puritanical streak in the negative sense,
yes,
in the pejorative sense of puritanical, rigid, dogmatic.
Exactly.
Obviously, we're seeing that now in Western culture, but mostly on what we would call the left. Tremendous rigidity, and worse than merely rigidity, lack of tolerance for another point of view, demonization of those who hold a different point of view. Yes. It's really astonishing to see it in Western culture, and that so it seems to me that that's part of what you're talking about in the culture.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an advisable term, because in Greek tragedy, and they were the people who originated tragedy, the story was always of a hero's hubris. He wanted to be like a god, believed he was a god, and as a result, the downfall was terrible. And I think we're in that phase. We've probably never had less wisdom than Western culture has ever had. There's so many things we don't think about or know about that people in the past would have done. We just pat ourselves on the back because we've got a more technical grasp on certain things that will help us make powerful tools. But in terms of human wisdom, understanding what a human being is and what life is for, we really have hit rock bottom. And as a result, you can see that people are extremely unhappy, anxious, suicidal. I mean, the young have been left without anything to encourage them except more technical information. This is awful. It's a tragedy, and unless we are able to do something very soon, this civilization will collapse.
I'm very sorry to agree with you. It's interesting that I have noticed just in my lifetime, in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades as an adult, how, for example, Shakespeare has vanished in the culture. I mean, in previous decades, when I was a kid, everyone, and I mean everyone,
Yes.
had some knowledge of Shakespeare, of the Bible, of Homer. It was just part of what it is to live in the West. It's our
Yes.
shared knowledge, and some people were experts, and some people hardly knew anything, but they knew something.
Yes.
It was a baseline.
Yes.
The poetry, the culture over the centuries and even millennia, it was there.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I have noticed only in the last decade, in a way, that, my goodness, where did it go? Was it just that I had missed something, but I realized no?
It's been deliberately suppressed.
Yeah.
There's a campaign to sort of do away with all the classical canon, which is no less than a tradition built up over a couple of thousand years. And these things can't be reinvented when they're destroyed. It's a living thing, a tradition. People think that it's to do with fossilizing beliefs, but it isn't. It's the only way in which belief can grow and change. You can't just destroy something and then hope to suddenly reinvent it. I often say it's like gardening. If you want a plant to grow up a wall, you don't cut it off and put it higher up the wall. You tend it towards where you want it to go and allow it to grow in that way. So a culture is an organism, a society is an organism, and it's not surprising that it reflects the ways of thinking of those who are the individuals in that society, which explains why one can speak of a civilization having a tendency towards left hemisphere thinking at the expense of right hemisphere thinking.